Hello there, welcome to Penarth Archery Club's YouTube channel. My name is Jeremy. This video is another in the series Archery the Basics that I've created and put onto our channel. There are already several videos available, one being a 3-part series on buying your first bow, then a video on arrow assembly, and 2 videos on the static setup of your bow. To follow on from the videos, basic bow setup parts 1 and 2, as I promised, I've done some videos about the bow tuning process to finish the full setup of your bow. We've looked at the basic static setup of the bow, but now need the archer to start shooting the bow so that we can match the bow setup to their shooting technique and ability. Bow tuning, as it is called, is actually the process of setting up and adjusting an archer's equipment to enable them to obtain the best performance from the equipment based on their existing level of their technique. It should always be emphasized that to work on the equipment, a part of bow tuning, will not bring about a significant increase in the archer's ability or consistency. It is a 2-part system, the archer and their equipment. With the basic setup of the bow completed successfully, with basic bow tuning we are making sure that the archer can get the best result from their current shooting ability, where they have a forgiving setup on their equipment. In other words, providing the archer does their bit, the equipment will perform and the combination will give the best achievable result. If the equipment was not correctly set up, it will affect the outcome. If the archer does not shoot well, it will affect the outcome. There are these 2 elements to consider. The biggest variable will always be the archer. The equipment's performance is usually consistent. Unfortunately, many archers spend too much time setting up, tuning and changing their equipment, trying to improve the overall result. Quite often you then look at their shooting technique and see that if they worked on their technique, the results would improve way beyond anything that tweaking their equipment would achieve. So it is important that the effort put into bow tuning is relative to the archer's ability. If they don't have a consistent technique, then there is a limit to the effectiveness of the bow tuning. So some work being done to produce a forgiving setup, but with the need for them to work on their technique. They go hand in hand. When we say a forgiving setup, what we're looking for is the combination of bow and arrow that does not overly penalise a less than ideal technique. An example would be an archer who is using too high a draw weight. They cannot comfortably shoot their bow and the results will not be ideal. Using expensive tournament arrows such as Eastern Aces when they have an inconsistent release, the results will not be ideal. Things like low brace height, arrow rest settings are not ideal, wrong pressure button settings, all of these can affect the overall performance. So we have already looked at the basic static setup. Obviously we need to keep in mind whether we're dealing with a right-handed or a left-handed archer. This really is about checking the shaft alignment when doing the static setup and observing the arrow reactions when shooting. Generally, you do the opposite of the advice given when dealing with the left to right flexion of the arrows. Instructions regarding knock height stay the same. It's only when looking at pressure button settings that we need to reverse the arrow position instructions. Most instructions are given for right-handed archers. I'm used to dealing with it as my wife Yvonne is left-handed, but it can catch people out. So now we bring in the influence of the archer by shooting the bow and assess whether the setup needs to be tweaked or is fine as it stands. When we start bow tuning and shooting arrows, I find it best to do this initially at a short distance. I usually do this work with a boss less than 5 paces away, sometimes as close as 3 paces. The boss is there to catch the shot arrows. It is not acting as a target. When the archer is doing bow tuning work, we need them to focus on the process, the technique, and not on the result, i.e. where the arrow went. The archer needs to shoot well and reshoot any less than ideal arrows, for example a bad loose or not in the correct reference position. I usually use bits of tape as aiming points, put them in a row across the boss and adjust them for various stages of the process. They are just sighting points. The archer is not trying to hit them, but use them as a sighting reference to get the arrows to hit the boss at the same height on the same level. What are we looking to do when we start bow tuning? We will consider an ILF recurve bow for this for the moment. When the bow is shot, we can listen to the bow, which is a method to determine whether the brace height is suitable and also that all the add-on bits of kit are secure. So make sure sights, rests, buttons, etc. are all tightened up. This, together with the correct brace height, is when we get a quiet bow compared to a noisy bow. We can check that the nocking height is correct. We can check whether we get optimum arrow clearance from flight. So the process is to check that the draw weight of the bow is acceptable, then check brace height, then look at nocking height, then the arrow flight from the bow. The key elements we can use to influence arrow flight with the equipment are really split into two sections. Macro tuning, where we make significant changes. One would be increasing or decreasing the draw weight of the bow by altering the limb bolt settings. The other main change would be using different spine arrows, but this would be a costly option and usually only considered where other changes have failed to produce a satisfactory result. Micro tuning is smaller changes where we are not far off from obtaining the arrow flight and bow performance we want. So using factors such as correct brace height, correct nocking height, and using the pressure button adjustments that are available. The bow tuning method I use is based on the fact that both personally and in our club we use banded foam bosses to shoot at. These are a wooden frame compressed in many thin layers of foam sheets with banding and are widely used here in the UK. The construction allows us to use them for tuning in several ways. I always set them up so the bosses stand vertical when tuning, not leaning back on a stand. Other foam bosses will usually work as well. Straw bosses are less than ideal for this method. The archer has their equipment set up as described in previous videos. So the process begins with the archer warming up and shooting. We want them to shoot as well as they can, concentrating on their technique. While they are shooting, we can start the tuning process by making sure they're comfortable with the draw weight and physical weight of the bow. We can listen to the sound of the bow and also observe the short arrow flight. We can also check on their technique. This will give us pointers on where work is needed going forward. When we did the static setup of the bow, we will have looked at brace height, but not actually been able to check whether the brace height we have set is the best. So brace height is first. When a bow is shot, the sound can be quite different when the brace height is changed. At a low brace height, the bow on release of the arrow can almost sound like a sharp crack or twang. A high brace height can give a more mellow sound, a resonance a bit like a hum, similar to a guitar string being plucked or a tap on a drum. So one sound is harsh, the other a bit like a tuning fork sound. Noise in a bow is excess energy, so a quiet bow is where the bow itself is coping with the energy. A noisy bow does not. We need to make sure that all the fittings are on the bow, as these can affect the sound, and that they are secure. Also, if using a long rod stabilizer, how effective is that? So we can adjust the brace height to get the quietest setting, usually more towards the higher setting of the brace height range. At a later date, we can do some brace height tuning to check things in more detail. We then need to check that the nocking point is still correct and working when the bow is shot. So we will get the archer to shoot at our foam boss some 3 to 5 paces away, the boss being set up in a vertical position. When looking at the nocking height, I put the boss on its side so that the thin foam strips are vertical. This means when an arrow hits the boss, there is little to stop the rear of the arrow moving up and down, as the arrow will slide between the foam strips. This makes it very easy to see if the nock end of the arrow is higher or lower than the point when in the boss. I usually put several taped crosses on the boss, set at approximately level height when the archer is at full draw. So this means the arrow flies horizontally into the boss, not shooting upwards or downwards. I get the archer to shoot at a cross and then move slightly to align with the next one, and so on. This way they are hopefully shooting straight at a cross and there's little to cause the arrow to deviate when it hits the boss. With several arrows shot, it will be easy to see if the arrow looks straight or knock down or knock up. I use this method and then use the images and descriptions for paper tuning in the Eastern Arrow Tuning Maintenance Guide, which I've mentioned before. It can be downloaded from the Eastern website and is a useful tool for archers. Rather than use a paper screen to shoot through in front of the boss, as suggested by the guide and many archers, the boss construction means the arrow is caught in its flight with minimal interference, so paperless tuning. So looking at the arrows in the boss and comparing that with the images of the paper tuning process is an easy way to see whether any adjustment needs to be made to the knocking height. If the arrow knock is low, so the knock end of the arrow is lower than the point in the boss, that shows a low knocking point, so we would raise the knock sets on the string. If the knock is high, the knock being above the point and shaft, this indicates a high knocking point, and we would lower the height of the knock sets. This is why I initially used tape or movable knock sets. Once we establish the correct knock height on the string to get a horizontal arrow flight and horizontal arrow in the boss and finish the remaining parts of the tuning process, then permanent knock sets can be used. Once we are happy with the knocking point height, we can move on to looking at the pressure button settings. As we have just sorted out the vertical flexing of the arrow to an acceptable degree by setting the knocking point, we will now be looking at the sideways flexing of the arrow. We will finish the video here and we'll leave the process there for the moment, and I will continue the bow tuning in the next video, together with a basic look at compound tuning. I hope there's some previous videos putting together the various elements of the equipment and an archer's ability to give some guidance and advice for improving in this sport of ours. So basic bow tuning part 2 to follow soon. As usual, I hope this video has been useful and informative for you, and would appreciate it if you could hit the like button below. If you haven't already subscribed to our channel, then perhaps consider doing so. So thank you for watching.